This is all I owe you. My father said those words while I was still holding my nursing degree, standing in the afternoon sun, outside McMaster University's Convocation Hall, with the sound of someone's family cheering in the distance. Before I go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from today. It always means something to me to see how far these stories reach. And if you're new to this channel, please subscribe. Because what happened that afternoon in Hamilton wasn't just about an envelope. It was the first crack in a wall that had been built around me since I was 10 years old. My name is Sabine, and for 4 years I had imagined what Convocation Day would feel like. I thought my father would shake my hand, at least. I thought maybe he'd say something like, "I'm proud of you." I thought maybe for once, I'd see in his face what I'd been quietly working toward since my mother died. That I had become something, that I had made it, that the years of struggle had added up to more than he'd ever expected from me. I had earned that degree the hard way. I'm talking back-to-back overnight shifts at a retirement home in Stony Creek, where I worked as a personal support worker to pay for my textbooks and groceries. I'm talking OSAP loans stacked on top of bursary applications, stacked on top of a part-time job at the Tim Hortons on Barton Street, just so I could make rent on a one-bedroom apartment I shared with 2 other women. I skipped spring break every year. I borrowed my neighbor's printer for assignments because I couldn't afford the on-campus print fees. I calculated the HST on groceries before I put them in my basket. 4 years. And that afternoon, in my rented graduation gown, with a bouquet of white carnations my grandmother had brought from her garden, I stood in that parking lot thinking maybe the worst was behind me. My grandmother had driven from Burlington, which wasn't a short drive, and she had worn the lilac blazer she saved for special occasions. When I came out of the hall, she opened her arms and held me the way she always had, like she was trying to transfer something steady into me through the hug alone. She whispered, "Your mother would be bursting right now." My mother had been gone for 19 years. Some days that felt like a long time. That day it felt like last week. My father had come with my stepmother and my half-brother, who was 16 and already tall enough that I had to look up at him slightly. My father wore his good dress shirt and his watch. He didn't hug me. He shook my hand, the way you'd shake the hand of a new colleague. My stepmother smiled at the middle distance somewhere behind my shoulder. My half-brother said congrats and looked at his phone. I told myself my father was tired from the drive. I'd told myself things like that my whole life. He had a way of making everything I accomplished feel smaller than it was. When I got into nursing school, he said I should have applied to medicine if I was serious about healthcare. When I made the dean's honor list in my second year, he said a list didn't mean anything until I had a full-time position. When I landed my clinical placement at St. Joseph's, he reminded me that placements weren't real jobs. I kept waiting for him to stop. I kept telling myself that one day, if I worked hard enough, he'd finally run out of ways to diminish what I'd done. I thought Convocation might be that day. After the ceremony, after the photographs under the university banners, after the chancellor's remarks and the slow procession through the hall, we stood together in the parking lot while other families took pictures and children climbed on the stone ledge near the entrance. My grandmother was telling me about a nurse she'd known decades ago, a woman from her church who had worked at the general hospital until she was 68. I could tell she was trying to make me feel like I was part of something larger than that afternoon. Then my father reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. For 1 second I thought it might be a card, the kind with a check tucked inside, or even just words, something. He held out a plain white envelope. "Here," he said. I took it. "What's this?" "Open it." I did. Inside was a small stack of bills. I counted them without meaning to. $150, 3 50s. I looked up at his face. There was no warmth there. There was something else, a flatness, almost a kind of relief, like a man who had just finished an obligation he'd been resenting for years. "Dad," I started. He leaned in slightly, not enough for it to look strange to anyone watching, but close enough that I could hear him clearly. "That's it. That's all I owe you. Everything else has been paid." I didn't understand the words at first. My brain moved around them, looking for another interpretation. "What?" I said. He didn't repeat it quietly. He said it again, the same volume, the same tone. $150, that's all I owe you. Everything else has already been paid. A man a few steps away was mid-law at something someone had said. He stopped. My grandmother, who had been right beside me, went very still. Dad, my voice had dropped, this isn't. I'm not interested in a scene, he said. We're done here. I looked down at the money in my hand. $150. I had spent more than that on the parking pass I needed for my clinical rotation. I had spent more than that in a single week on groceries the previous winter when prices spiked. I wanted to throw the bills into the wind coming off the escarpment. I wanted to say something that would reach him. But my throat had closed completely. My grandmother stepped forward. She put herself between me and my father in a way that wasn't dramatic, but was absolutely deliberate. She looked at him. What did you just say to her? He told her we were making it into something it wasn't. She shook her head, slow and sure. Don't. She looked at my stepmother, who had gone pale and was studying a spot on the pavement. Then she looked back at my father. Her voice was even. We will talk about this later. My half-brother was standing just behind my stepmother. When my eyes found his, he looked away almost immediately. That stung in a different way. Sharper somehow because he was young enough that I hadn't expected him to choose a side yet. But silence is a choice, even at 16. My grandmother reached for my arm and pulled me gently a few steps away from them. Her hand was shaking. Sabine, her voice was different now, lower, something behind it I couldn't name. I'm okay. I'm okay. She shook her head. No, listen to me. She glanced back toward my father, who was already walking toward the car. What just happened? It isn't the whole story. What he just said to you isn't the whole story. I didn't understand. What do you mean? She looked down at the money still in my hand, then back at me. Something moved across her face, not just anger. It was recognition, like a door opening inside her that she hadn't meant to open. Come to my house on Sunday, she said. Just you. Don't say anything to your father first. Don't bring your brother. Just come to me. Gran, you're scaring me. She squeezed my arm. Good, because I have been too quiet for too long, and I should have said something years ago. Then she looked over her shoulder, straightened up, and walked back toward my father's car. I stood there in the parking lot with my degree under one arm and $150 in my hand, watching my family drive away. I didn't sleep properly for the next 4 days. I kept returning to the same words. Everything else has been paid. My father had never supported me financially during university. Every cent had come from OSAP, from bursaries, from my own 2 jobs. He hadn't co-signed anything. He hadn't sent money. There had been no payments. Or had there been, and I just hadn't known. Sunday arrived, and I drove to my grandmother's house in Burlington on a gray November morning, parked in her narrow driveway, and she opened the door before I'd even reached the porch. She had coffee ready. She didn't offer it to me. Instead, she walked directly to the kitchen pantry, reached past the jars of tomato preserves she made every September, and pulled out a flat metal tin, old, scratched along the lid. She placed it on the kitchen table and sat down across from me. Your mother gave me this, she said. A few months before she went into the hospital. She said to keep it somewhere safe. I stared at the tin. Mum gave you that? She told me there were documents inside that you would need when you were grown. My grandmother's voice was very careful. She made me promise I would make sure you got them. She paused. I thought your father had taken care of everything. I thought he had done what he was supposed to do, so I waited. And I waited too long. She opened the tin. Inside was a set of folded papers, aged at the edges, soft in the creases. She slid them across the table. The top document was a copy of a trust agreement. The name on it was my mother's. The beneficiary was mine, and the trustee named to manage it was my father. My mouth went dry. What is this? My grandmother folded her hands. Your mother set up a trust for you before she died. She had her life insurance, her savings from the years before she got sick. She put it together through a lawyer in Kitchener. She also had a registered education savings plan she'd been building for you since you were 2 years old. I stared at the paper. I didn't have an RESP. Dad always said there wasn't enough money. That's why I applied for OSAP. That's why I worked. My grandmother looked at the table. That's what he told you. The silence in that kitchen was the loudest thing I have ever heard. She explained it slowly, carefully, the way someone does when they are choosing each word like they are stepping across ice. After my mother died, my father became the trustee. It was his legal responsibility to manage those funds for my benefit, specifically for my education and my future. The rest spec was to be used for my post-secondary schooling. The trust would have left money beyond that. My grandmother had assumed, all these years, that the money was being used for me. She had seen me struggling through university and had tried to send me what she could herself, but she had told herself that my father was managing the larger picture, that everything was in order. I should have asked, she said quietly. Years ago I should have asked him. I drove home from Burlington with photocopies of the documents on the seat beside me, and I didn't trust myself to look at them until I was inside my apartment with the door locked. Then I pulled out every piece of financial paperwork I had kept from 4 years of university. Old OSAP applications, bursary forms, bank statements, the letter from my landlord that first year when I was 3 weeks late on rent because a shift got cut. I called my friend Mila, who'd been working at a credit union in Hamilton for 3 years, and understood financial documents the way I understood a patient chart. When she came over and spread everything across my kitchen table, the first thing she said was, "Sabine, your OSAP applications don't show any trust assets." "Shouldn't they?" I asked. She looked up at me. "If there was a trust account with your father as trustee and you as beneficiary, it depends on how it was structured, but if the money was being used for your benefit, it should have been showing up somewhere. In tuition payments, in reduced loan amounts, in something." She stopped. "It's not showing up anywhere," she said. We spent 4 hours going through everything. Then Mila helped me submit formal requests for the complete trust account history through the appropriate legal channels. Every statement, every withdrawal, every transfer. I did not call my father, not yet. Mila told me not to. She said if he knew I was looking, anything that was missing could become very difficult to prove. But a week later, I drove to his house in Oakville anyway. I told myself I was just going for a visit. I wanted to see his face when I mentioned my mother's name. He was watching the hockey game. My stepmother was folding laundry on the couch. My half-brother was upstairs, and I could hear the low murmur of his gaming headset. We made small talk for 15 minutes. He asked whether I'd started my job search yet. I said I had a few interviews lined up at hospitals in Hamilton. He nodded in the way he did when he'd already stopped listening. Then, as neutrally as I could manage, I said, "Gran showed me some of Mum's old documents the other day." He put down his glass. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I was watching his face, and in those 2 seconds, everything changed. His shoulders pulled back, his jaw tightened. "What documents?" he said. "Just some things she'd kept, trust papers, some RESC records." "Why is she going through old paperwork?" My stepmother had set down the shirt she was folding. She was looking at my father now, not at me. "I don't know," I said. "I was just curious what they were." My father stood up. "Your mother has been gone for 19 years. There's nothing in those papers that's relevant anymore." "Was there money set aside for me?" I asked. The room went absolutely still. "What?" His voice dropped. "Was there a trust account and RESP? Mum set one up before she died, didn't she?" "Who told you that?" "So there was something," I said. He pointed at me. "You want to talk about gratitude? I raised you on my own for years before I remarried. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your food, your school supplies, your hockey fees when you were a kid." "You didn't pay for university," I said. "That was OSAP, that was bursaries, that was me working nights at a retirement home." "You always want more," he said. "You've always been ungrateful, even when you were small." My stepmother stepped closer to him. "Your father gave up a lot for you," she said. "You should be thanking him." I looked toward the staircase. My half-brother had appeared at the top. He was sitting on the top step, half hidden by the wall, listening. I didn't say anything else. I picked up my jacket and walked out. Sitting in the driveway in the dark, I let myself breathe for the first time in an hour. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't laughed it off, or said there was some simple explanation. His first reaction had been to list everything he'd done. Which is exactly what people say when they don't want to talk about what they've taken. I called my grandmother that night. She listened, then gave me the name of an estate lawyer, a woman named Miss Hutchinson, who worked out of a small firm near James Street North in Hamilton, and had been handling trusts and estates for over 20 years. I brought everything to her office the following week. She went through it all without expression for a long time. Then she looked at me and said, "Sabine, stop talking to your father directly, let the records speak." She explained that as the named trustee of a trust created for my benefit, my father had been legally obligated to manage those funds for me and me alone. Misappropriating trust funds in Ontario, using them for personal expenses unrelated to the beneficiary, was not just a civil matter. Depending on the amounts and the intent, it could rise to criminal breach of trust under the criminal code. Hearing that made the whole thing feel real in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't just my father being cold or difficult. If what we suspected was true, he had stolen from me. From my dead mother's plans for me. For years. Miss Hutchinson submitted formal requests for the complete trust history. While we waited, my grandmother told me the original amounts. My mother's life insurance payout, her savings, the respite contributions. Together, she said, it had been more than enough to cover a full degree and still leave something for my future. I thought about the retirement home shifts. The OSAP interest accumulating while I slept. The winter I kept my thermostat at 16 degrees because I couldn't afford higher. Why didn't you tell me? I asked my grandmother. She looked down at her hands. I trusted him, he was my son. She looked up. I am so sorry, sweetheart. I am so sorry I waited this long. I held her hand and told her I didn't blame her. I meant it. She hadn't taken anything from me. But her apology opened something in my chest that I had spent most of my adult life keeping sealed. The records arrived on a Thursday. Miss Hutchinson called and asked me to come in the next morning. When I sat down in her office, she placed a thick folder on the desk between us. I want you to be prepared, she said. I opened it. The trust had been substantial, more than I'd imagined seeing the original figures. And then the withdrawals began, one after another, starting the year after my mother died and continuing for nearly 2 decades. Miss Hutchinson pointed to the descriptions on each transaction. A lump sum payment on my father's Oakville mortgage, a vehicle purchase, a Lexus SUV registered in my stepmother's name, private school tuition for my half-brother at an academy in Mississauga, year after year, home renovations, trips to Cuba, to Mexico, to Barbados, a down payment on a cottage property in the Kawarthas, registered in my father's name. Nothing with my name on it, not a single disbursement for education, not one. I turned page after page. How much is left? I finally asked. Miss Hutchinson was quiet for a moment. Very little, she said. A fraction. I sat with that. The RESP had been cashed in when I was 17. The penalties for early withdrawal in Canada would have consumed a significant portion of it. Whatever wasn't lost in penalties had disappeared into my father's household income that year. The hardest part of the folder was seeing my half-brother's name on the tuition records. His private school fees, year after year. I was not angry at him. He had been a child. He hadn't chosen any of it. But seeing those pages, the money that had been my mother's, used to give him opportunities she had wanted me to have. Left me sitting in that chair completely hollowed out. My grandmother wept when I showed her the statements. She said, I should have checked. Years ago I should have checked. I told her it wasn't her fault. She had trusted her son. What he had done was the crime, not her faith in him. Miss Hutchinson gave me the choice. A quiet settlement to recover what we could, or a court filing that would put everything on public record. She laid both paths out clearly. I told her I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth acknowledged. I wanted my father to sit across from me and face what he'd done. So I asked my grandmother for one more thing. I asked her to host a dinner, just the family, a belated celebration of Convocation since the day itself had been cut short. She could tell my father that much. Nothing else. She agreed without hesitation. My father confirmed he'd come. My stepmother said they'd bring dessert. My half-brother said he'd be there. The night before, I sat in my grandmother's kitchen helping her set the table. She watched me arrange the cutlery twice in a row and said, You don't have to do this tonight. I looked at the chair where my father would sit. Yes, I do. I said, I've been afraid of him my whole life. I'm done with that. She put a hand on my shoulder and kept it there. The next evening, everyone arrived, and the first 30 minutes were almost ordinary. My father told a story about something at work. My stepmother talked about renovations they were considering in their kitchen. My half-brother ate quietly and barely looked up. My grandmother kept glancing at me. I kept my face even. After dessert, a buttered tart pie my grandmother had made, the kind my mother used to love, I stood up and placed the folder on the table. There's something I need to talk about, I said. My father's expression shifted immediately. I opened the folder and began laying the statements flat one at a time. The mortgage payment, the Lexus, the school tuition every year, the cottage down payment, the vacations. These are the records from Mum's trust, I said. The one you were appointed to manage for me. My stepmother's face lost its color. What trust? She said, though something in her voice told me she already knew. My father pushed back from the table. Where did you get those? From the trust account, I said, which you were legally required to administer for my benefit alone. He stood up. He said I didn't understand how much it had cost to raise me. He said he had sacrificed. He said I was looking at numbers on a page and deciding I understood them when I didn't. He said everything he had done had been for the family. I asked him to point to a single withdrawal that had been made for my education. He didn't answer. My grandmother looked at her son from across the table. Her voice was completely steady. You stood in my kitchen after she died and told me everything was handled. That the money would go to her the way her mother wanted. He said he had done what was necessary. She said for your household, not for hers. My half-brother said very quietly, Dad, just that. My father turned to him. My half-brother looked at the tuition records still spread on the table. He looked at me. Did you use her money for my school? Silence. He turned to me. His face was doing something young and complicated. Sabine, he said, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I'm sorry. That apology broke something open in me, not in a bad way, in the way that something finally gets to breathe after a long time underground. My father said we were all against him, that he hadn't come to be ambushed. He walked to the hallway, grabbed his jacket and left. The front door closed hard enough that the frames on my grandmother's wall shifted slightly. The 5 of us remaining sat in a silence that lasted a long time. My stepmother got up quietly and began collecting plates. She said nothing to me, but she didn't defend him either. The legal process took 4 months. When my father's lawyer reviewed the documents, he advised settling. The agreement required my father to repay a negotiated portion of what could still be recovered, secured through a lien on the Kawartha cottage, the one purchased with my mother's trust money in the first place. It wasn't everything. There is no number that accounts for the shifts I worked, or the scholarships I scrambled for, or the years I spent believing that strugglings was simply what I deserved. But the truth was on paper, undeniably. My grandmother called me on a Tuesday morning, a few weeks after the settlement was signed. She told me she'd spoken to her own lawyer. She wanted to sign over her small lake property on Lake Erie to me, a modest cabin her own mother had left her. The one where I had spent summers as a child learning to swim and pick blueberries and sit quietly enough to hear the loons calling at dusks. She said it wasn't payment, she said it was a foundation, a place that was mine and that no one could take from me. I used part of the settlement to pay off my OSAP in full. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't owe anything to anyone except my own future. My half-brother and I have been talking more. Carefully, slowly, the way you talk when you're both still figuring out what the other person means to you once all the pretending falls away. He asked me once, a few months after the dinner, whether I was angry at him. I told him the truth. I had never been angry at him. He hadn't chosen any of it, and what he'd done apologized, without being asked, in front of our father, told me more about who he was than anything that had come before. The 350s from Convocation Day are framed now. They hang above the small desk in the cabin, in a plain black frame my grandmother helped me choose. I didn't do it because the money meant anything. I did it because of what my father said when he handed me that envelope in the parking lot outside McMaster. He said that was all he owed me. He said everything else had already been paid. He was wrong on both counts. What my mother left me hadn't truly been taken, not the part that mattered most. It had just been delayed. And what I deserved had never been determined by what my father was willing to give me. It was determined by what my mother believed I was worth, before she even knew who I would become. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you had been standing in that parking lot, holding that envelope, and you later found out what I found out, what would you have done? Would you have settled quietly, gone to court, or something else entirely? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you in the next one.